Welcome to Russian History Retold, episode 358, Catherine the Great, Revisited. Last time, we covered Ivan Grozny, or as most people know him, Ivan the Terrible. Today, we finish up our series revisiting some of the giants of Russian history. I believe we need to start our journey revisiting Catherine to start with her life before she came to Russia. Born Sophia Augusta Fredrika of Anhalt-Zerbst, she was the daughter of minor nobility who were not very well off. Her parents, like Father Christian August, was a military officer and German prince. He was a caring man who was satisfied by his position, although it wasn't very well paying. Her mother, though, Johanna Elizabeth, was quite different. Sophia was generally closer to her father, who was viewed as steady and dutiful. Her mother was more societally ambitious and focused heavily on arranging a prestigious marriage for her daughter. Over the years, Johanna would regret marrying someone like Christian, who she believed was beneath her status. Her relatives were much wealthier than his, and this would irk the mother of the future Empress of Russia. While the future Catherine was closer to her steady father, his call to duty would stop him from having a greater influence on her. Johanna, on the other hand, would be the person to make the deal to get her daughter married to Charles Peter Ulrich of Schleswig-Holstein-Gottorp in 1745. When describing the young Sophia, contemporaries and later accounts would say she was intelligent, curious, energetic, self-confident, very strong-willed, and ambitious from a young age. According to the website worldhistory.com, Sophia enjoyed games, leadership roles among other children, and showed an early determination to shape her own future. Unlike many royal children, she was not raised in luxury. Her upbringing emphasized discipline, duty, and education rather than extravagance. Sophia thought that she and her childhood was boring. She once wrote to her correspondent, Baron Grimm, "I see nothing of interest in it." I cannot emphasize enough how crucial Catherine's upbringing was in influencing her actions while Empress of Russia. Her education included learning both French and her native German, which set her up for learning Russian when she arrived in 1744 at the age of 15. The lure of marrying a potential future emperor of Russia must have been great enough of a motivator for Sophia, as she didn't think much of Peter when she first met him at the age of 10. According to author Michael Streeter, quote, "She immediately found Peter detestable, and that she stayed at one end of the castle and Peter at the other. His looks and his fondness for alcohol at this young age were two things the future Catherine found quite disturbing." The years before their marriage was fraught with danger and intrigue. The choice of Sophia was part of a conspiracy concocted by Count Jean-Armand de Lestock and King Frederick the Great of Prussia to further the relationship between Prussia and Russia and to diminish the influence of Austria. This was to ultimately fail miserably. Empress Elizabeth would continue to back the Austrians and the French through the War of the Austrian Succession, which lasted between 1740 and 1748, and the 7 Years' War of 1756 and 1763. This support would end with Elizabeth's death in 1762, with Peter III having great admiration for the Prussian king, Frederick the Great. When the empress died, Frederick was actually considering surrendering, as the Russian army had briefly captured Berlin. Peter would reverse the Russians' position, handing the British-Prussian side victory in the 7 Years' War. This decision would lay the groundwork for Peter's overthrow and would give Catherine the throne in his stead. The way Peter was overthrown and his subsequent murder cast a very long shadow on Catherine's reign, and she did everything she could to protect herself. As Jeffrey Hosking puts it in his book, Russia and the Russians, A History, quote, Catherine II had a more direct interest in institutions and law than any of her predecessors, for her claim to the throne was weaker than theirs. She was not an offspring of any branch of the Romanov dynasty. Without the stable support of her subjects, embodied in institutions and laws, she was always vulnerable to any chance conspiracy among the Guard officers. While a number of her advisors, like Nikita Panin, had distinct ideas about how the government should be reformed, as Hosking puts it, quote, Catherine had her own ideas about how government might be reformed and legal order introduced. These she had imbibed from the Enlightenment thinkers she had read in conscious preparation for imperial responsibility. She felt it important to have law validated by representatives of her peoples, and so, in 1767, she convened a law code commission consisting of delegates from various estates of society and composed for her own set of recommendations, articulated in a nakaz, or, as they know it, memorandum. Catherine's ideas somewhat mirrored those of Peter I, as she wrote, quote, in a state, that is, in a collection of people living in a society where laws are established, liberty can only consist in the ability of doing what everyone ought to desire, and in not being forced to do what should not be desired. While Catherine had noble desires to reform her country, it would actually come to naught, as the Commission could not agree on much, and by the onset of war against the Ottoman Empire in 1768, the Empress would disband the group, sending them back to their homes to mobilize the citizens for military service. She would never reconvene them again. The Russo-Turkish War of 1768 to 1774 would be one of two such conflicts that would occur under Catherine's reign. It would inflict some of the biggest defeats of the Turks in their history. This war would begin the downward spiral of the Ottoman Empire, which would lead to its demise in 1922. Catherine would divide the empire into 50 guberneri, or provinces, along with 360 uezdi, or districts. The guberni would be governed by governors appointed by the monarch. The nobility would be elevated into these important positions, which had an unfortunate negative side effect. It would solidify the power of the nobility over half of the Russian population, the serfs. As historian John Ladone would write in his book, The Grand Strategy of the Russian Empire, 1650 to 1831, quote, serfdom was inseparable from the political supremacy of the nobility, the legitimacy of the ruling house, and the destiny of Great Russia. It is clear that Catherine despised the system of serfdom in Russia, but she was under no delusion that she did not have the power nor the support of the nobility to abolish this hideous institution. Still, she would weaken the protection of the laws, making serfs mere property with little that they could do to improve their lives. One of the things that Catherine's reign was noted for was her supposed devotion towards education. One of her early reforms was the creation of the Cadet Corps. From the outside, it was viewed as a training center for army officials. It also served as a training center for civil servants, something that was in great demand after the Empress's reforms. Catherine believed she could develop a new kind of person by teaching Russian children with a European-styled education. Catherine believed education could change the hearts and minds of the Russian people and turn them away from backwardness. This backwardness was something that would linger on until after the Russian Revolution in 1917. Ivan Ivanovich Betskoy would be tasked by the Empress to develop the Russian education system. He was an educational reformer who served as Catherine II's advisor as the president of the Imperial Academy of Arts from 1764 to 1794. Betskoy would be remembered because he helped with the establishment of Russia's first unified system of public education. Betskoy would also found the Smolny Institute in 1764, the first of its kind in Russia. In the beginning, the institute only admitted young girls of the noble elite, but eventually it began to admit girls of the petite bourgeoisie as well. The environment, though, was a very strict one, with playing games and running around considered forbidden. Although Catherine and Betskoy would fail to make a substantial difference in building a sustainable education system, some historians claimed that the reason for this is that Catherine failed to supply enough money to support her educational program. According to author Madariaga, quote, by the end of Catherine's reign, an estimated 62,000 pupils were being educated in some 549 state institutions. While a significant improvement, it was only a minuscule number compared to the size of the Russian population. Of course, one of the crowning glories of Catherine's was her devotion to the arts and culture. By 1790, the Hermitage, which was originally built to hold the Empress's art collection, was home to 38,000 books, 10,000 gems, and 10,000 drawings. At Tsarskoye Selo, Catherine had an English landscape garden planted. As she wrote in her letter to Voltaire in 1772, quote, right now, I adore English gardens, curves, gentle slopes, ponds in the form of lakes, archipelagos on dry land. I have a profound scorn for straight lines, symmetric avenues. I hate fountains that torture water in order to make it take a course contrary to its state nature. Statues are relegated to galleries, vestibules, etc. In a word, Anglomania is the master of my plantomania. She would also be swept up in the European craze of all things Chinese. Between 1762 and 1766, she had built the quote-unquote Chinese palace, or Oranienbaum, which reflected the chinoiserie style of architecture and gardening. In 1779, she hired the Scottish architect Charles Cameron to build the Chinese village at Tsarskoye Selo. At first, Catherine actually tried to find a Chinese architect, but was unable to find one with enough experience. As I mentioned earlier, Catherine had a fine education as a child, which carried on to her adulthood as she would import intellectuals and scientists into Russia. According to authors Trent and Zaretsky, quote, she worked with Voltaire, Diderot, and D'Alembert, all French encyclopedists who later cemented her reputation in their writings. The leading economists of her day, such as Arthur Young and Jacques Necker, became foreign members of the Free Economic Society, established on her suggestion in St. Petersburg in 1765. She recruited the scientists Leonhard Euler and Peter Simon Pallas from Berlin and Anders Johann Lexell from Sweden to the Russian capital. The Empress was also a voracious reader. There were three types of books she enjoyed. Those written for entertainment, one for information purposes, and a third on philosophy. She particularly liked the work of German comic writers such as Moritz August von Thümmel and Christoph Friedrich Nicolai. In the second category, those written by Denis Diderot, Jacques Necker, Johann Bernhard Bastow, and Georges Louis Leclerc and Comte de Buffon caught her eye. Yet another accomplishment that is attributed to Catherine is the Nakaz, or instruction. It was a statement of legal principles written by her, which was infused with the ideas of the French Enlightenment. It was composed as a guide for the All-Russian Legislative Commission, organized in 1767, for the purpose of replacing the mid-17th century Muscovite Code of Laws with a modern law code. One of the things that brought the most fear into Catherine's heart was the numerous rebellions that occurred during her reign, Of course, the scariest one was the Pugachev Rebellion. Led by Yemelyan Pugachev, it would last for almost 2 years between 1773 and 1775. It came to a head due to the previously mentioned reforms that Catherine instituted. It was that she confirmed the authority of the nobles over the serfs in return for the nobles' political cooperation. This led to the serfs no longer being tied to the land, but owned by the noblemen who owned the land. This led to one of the greatest revolts in Russian history, only topped by the Revolution of 1917. Another event that added to the misery, and I mean terrible misery, of many of the peasants and serfs of the day was the Russian plague epidemic of 1770 to 72, also known as the Plague of 1771. That's when it really hit its apex. It would be the last large-scale outbreak of plague in central Russia, claiming between 52,000 and 100,000 lives in Moscow alone, which amounted to between 1/6 to 1/3 of its population. For those of you who remember my interview with author Lucy Ward, who wrote The Empress and the English Doctor, Catherine would be instrumental in helping to control another deadly contagious disease, smallpox. Because of her trust in science and wanting to protect herself and her son Paul from this disfiguring and sometimes deadly disease, Catherine would allow herself and Paul to be inoculated by English Dr. Thomas Dimsdale. While controversial at the time, she would be quoted as saying, quote, "My objective was, through my example, to save from death the multitude of my subjects who, not knowing the value of this technique and frightened of it, were left in danger." By 1800, approximately 6% of the Russian population, or 6 million people, had been inoculated. Another accomplishment of Catherine's was the expansion of the Russian Empire. During her time as empress, she added Novorossiya, which would become southern Ukraine, Crimea, the northern Caucasus, the right bank Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, and Courland, at the expense mainly of two powers, the Ottoman Empire and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This would extend the borders of Russian Empire by some 520,000 square kilometers, or 200,000 square miles. Physically, Catherine was seen as being quite small, but regal. Madame Vigée-Lebrun also describes the Empress at a gala, quote, "The double doors opened, and the Empress appeared. I have said that she was quite small, and yet on the days when she made her public appearances, with her head held high, her eagle-like stare, and a countenance accustomed to command, all this gave her such an air of majesty that to me she might have been the queen of the world. She wore the sashes of 3 orders, and her costume was both simple and regal. It consisted of a muslin tunic embroidered with gold, fastened by a diamond belt, and the full sleeves were folded back in the Asiatic style. Over this tunic she wore a red velvet dolman with very short sleeves. The bonnet, which held her white hair, was not decorated with ribbons, but with the most beautiful diamonds." Catherine's relationships with religion were unique for her time. While she obviously embraced Russian Orthodoxy, which she had to in order to stay in power, her attitude toward the institution was not very supportive. She nationalized all of the church lands to help pay for her wars, largely emptied the monasteries, and forced most of the remaining clergymen to survive as farmers or from fees for baptisms and other services. Very few members of the nobility entered the church, which became even less important than it had been. When it came to Islam, Catherine avoided violence against this growing sector of the empire, using financial incentives for the conversion of these people to Orthodoxy. They were banned from owning Orthodox serfs, but were allowed to practice their faith openly. This would anger many Russians and would lead to a number of mosques being burned. This would be memorialized via the, quote, Toleration of All Faiths edict, which Muslims were permitted to build mosques and practice all of their traditions, the most obvious of these being the pilgrimage to Mecca, which had been previously denied. As for Judaism, Catherine was less tolerant and wanted them separated from the rest of the population. She did this by restricting them to what's known as the Pale of Settlement. This was a western region of the Russian Empire with varying borders that existed from 1791 to 1917, in which permanent residency by Jewish subjects was allowed. While she wanted them to benefit economically, which helped the Russian economy, she would tax them at twice the rate of the Orthodox population. Well, if they converted to Orthodoxy, they would then see their taxes reduced. One of the main reasons for the Pale of Settlement was due to the first partition of Poland in 1772. This would bring in a large number of Jews into the Russian Empire. The Jewish population would be dramatically increased when the second partition of Poland occurred in 1793. Added restrictions would occur under Nicholas I and would be somewhat relaxed under Alexander II, but would be greatly tightened after his assassination under the highly conservative and anti-Semitic rule of Alexander III. Catherine's reign, which began on July 9, 1762, would last for 34 years, 4 months, 8 days, until her death from a stroke on November 17, 1796. French painter and visitor to Russia, which we talked about, Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun, would describe the ceremony after Catherine's death this way. Quote, "The Empress's body lay in state for 6 weeks in a large and magnificently decorated room in the castle, which was kept lit day and night. Catherine was stretched on a ceremonial bed surrounded by the coat of arms of all the towns in Russia. Her face was left uncovered, and her fair hand rested on the bed. All the ladies, some of whom took turns to watch by the body, would go and kiss this hand, or at least appear to." Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Join me next time when we begin what I believe will be about a 2-part series, and it will be about the heads of the Soviet secret police. And so we're going to start with part 1. There's about 18 people that we're going to be covering through all the different gyrations of the secret police, from the Cheka all the way to the KGB. So, until next time, до свидания и спасибо за внимание.